So, here is a thought experiment that honestly keeps me up at night.
Oh boy. Okay. Lay it on me.
If a surgeon, opened your skull right now, peeled back the layers, really exposed the gray matter, could they point to the specific cluster of neurons where your honesty lives?
Right, like finding a zip code for a personality trait.
Exactly. Or could they cut out a piece of tissue, put it in a little jar, and say, well, there you go, we just removed his greed?
I mean, that is the ultimate materialist dream, isn't it? Mapping the entire geography of the soul. If you just have a good enough map, you can find the exact coordinates for every virtue, every vice, every memory.
Yeah, and for a long time, especially in the era we are doing our deep dive into today, people really thought the answer was a hard yes. But the text we're looking at today basically takes a sledgehammer to that whole machine.
It really does.
We are analyzing a book called The Mental Unity of Existence. Specifically, we're zooming in on Chapter 10 by the Iraqi philosopher Abdul-Jabbar Al-Waily.
And we should mention, this was published in its first edition in 1964, which is crucial context.
Right, because science was super focused on biology then.
Exactly. We are at the absolute height of a materialist boom in science. And here comes al-Waeli, basically standing in front of the tank. He is arguing for this profound dualist perspective, that the mind is this superior, non-physical entity that uses the brain as a tool, but is completely distinct from it.
He is fighting the hardware versus software battle way before anyone was using those terms. And he starts by just relentlessly attacking what he calls the localization of the mind.
The idea that specific character traits have physical addresses in the brain.
Yes. Reading this part felt like watching a demolition job. He really hates the idea that the brain is just some sort of filing cabinet.
Well, it's more than hate. I'd say it is a logical dismantling. Because in the mid-20th century and even earlier, you had scientists actually claiming there were literal spots in the brain for truth, or a spot for treachery, or vice.
Which sounds a bit like phrenology, right?
Very similar lineage, but al-Waeli looks at this and essentially says, you are mistaking the map for the territory. He concedes the brain is a vast ocean, sure, but he insists the capital M mind is an indivisible unit. It functions as a whole. You cannot have a slice of the mind.
Right, hence the title, The Mental Unity. But let's dig into why he thinks that. Because honestly, to a modern listener, it might feel intuitive to think, oh, this part of my brain does math and this part feels sad.
Sure, but al-Waeli argues that intuition is flawed because our mental functions rely on an interplay of what he calls the 5 mental faculties. You can't slice up the mind, because all the components are entirely interdependent.
And he uses this really primal, almost stark analogy to prove this, right? The interplay between will and memory.
Yes, the bread versus stone argument.
I loved this part. It stuck with me because it is so incredibly simple, but really hard to argue against. Do you want to walk us through it?
Sure. So imagine you are starving. You have a choice in front of you.
Yeah.
A piece of bread or a stone. You obviously choose the bread.
Right.
That choice is your will in action. The ability to prefer one thing over another. But al-Waeli asks, how can you prefer the bread if you don't remember what bread tastes like? Or if you don't remember that a stone will break your teeth? Or, preferring water over fire when you're thirsty?
Without memory, the will is just blind.
Exactly. If you could physically cut out the memory sector of this supposed compartmentalized mind, you haven't just lost the past. You entirely crippled the will in the present. You can't choose because you have zero data to act upon.
So his point is that these aren't just separate tools in a toolbox that you can swap out. It is a single, unified system.
An all-or-nothing system. If one part fails, the structural integrity of the whole consciousness collapses. It is not a Swiss Army knife with different blades. It is the single edge of the blade itself.
Which naturally brings us to the hardware question. If the mind is this unified ghost in the machine, then what exactly is the brain to him? Just a bucket holding it.
That leads right into his take on intelligence and genius, which is fascinating, because he spends a huge chunk of this chapter dismantling the big brain theory.
The mega mind fallacy. That a genius must have a massive skull. I swear cartoons are to blame for that one. Big head equals smart villain.
It's a very pervasive cultural idea.
Yeah.
And al-Waeli tackles this by citing a prominent thinker of his time, Salama Musa.
Right. Musa was the guy who initially thought brain size was everything. Mass equals brain power.
Exactly. But later, Musa actually corrected himself. He had to pivot, and he started suggesting that maybe intelligence wasn't about the size of the brain, but about the blood supply, the network of arteries feeding the brain.
Basically saying better plumbing equals better thinking. which I guess sounds a bit more scientific. More oxygen, better performance.
It does. But al-Waeli isn't fully buying that either. He acknowledges that biology matters. Of course, you need a healthy brain. But the difference between a genius and an average person isn't the size of the container or the plumbing.
It's about his concept of intellectual atoms, which sounds totally like something from a 1960s sci-fi novel. But he isn't talking about physical atoms in the brain tissue, right?
No, not at all. He is talking about the content of the mind, the density of ideas. He defines genius through a concept he calls deductive fertility.
Deductive fertility.
Right. He says the core difference isn't hardware speed, it's the direction of your mental focus. And he uses this incredibly beautiful metaphor of the introvert versus the extrovert.
Oh, the diver sitting on the shore? I have that highlighted.
Go ahead. How does he describe it?
He says the genius is like an introvert sitting on the shore of their own thoughts, diving into the ocean to find precious pearls, which are new ideas. And to the outside world, this person might look completely dull or absent-minded.
Because they aren't paying attention to the street traffic or what someone is wearing. Their energy is turned entirely inward. They're processing.
Right. And he contrasts this with the average person whose memory is entirely occupied with external reality. They're focused outward, they see everything, they record it, but they never dive.
They don't deduce. It is the difference between a high-end camera and a painter. The camera perfectly records the street signs and the faces, high resolution, perfect focus. But it doesn't understand anything it sees.
While the painter might totally miss the details of the room they are sitting in because they are busy creating something entirely new on the canvas.
That is a perfect way to put it. Al-Waeli says the average person's memory is filled with mere photos of reality, while the genius is filled with deductions. The genius creates new compounds from the mental atoms they already have.
So deductive fertility is the ability to take two facts, mash them together internally, and birth a third, completely new idea.
Exactly. And this is why he rejects the big brain theory so hard. You don't need a giant physical head to have deep thoughts. You need a specific type of internal mental processing. It's about the software, not the hard drive storage space.
Okay, but we have to play devil's advocate here for a second. And to his credit, al-Waeli does too in the text, because clearly if you get hit in the head with a baseball bat, your thinking stops working properly. Biology clearly matters. You can't just philosophize away a severe concussion.
And al-Waeli completely concedes this point. He actually brings up medical evidence from the First World War. Remember, this was written when the medical aftermath of those specific trench warfare injuries was still very prominent in science.
Right. He talks about soldiers who suffered highly specific brain injuries from bullets or shrapnel, which led to very specific physical failures, like blindness or the paralysis of a hand.
He specifically cites Joule's theory of localization here. The idea that if a bullet hits this precise spot in the cortex, your hand stops working.
Which seems, on its face, to prove the materialist's completely right. If destroying the spot destroys the function, then the hand-moving ability lives in that spot.
It definitely looks that way on the surface,
Yeah.
But this is where al-Waeli draws a brilliant, crucial line in the sand. He distinguishes between the wires and the signal.
Okay, let's unpack that, because I think this is the absolute core of his defense of the mind.
He argues that the nerves controlling the hand, or the eye, or the tongue are physical, bodily nerves. They are the machinery. They are the copper wiring in the walls of your house. If you cut the wire to a lamp, the lamp goes out.
And I see where he's going with this. You haven't destroyed the electricity itself, and you certainly haven't destroyed the actual concept of light.
Precisely. He calls the mind the first principle instinct. And he says that instinct remains completely intact. The idea of moving the hand is still there. The desire to move it is still there. The mental faculty is completely untouched. It just has a broken tool.
So if my hand is paralyzed because of a physical brain injury, al-Waeli is saying I have not lost the will to move my hand.
Yes. The pilot is still sitting in the cockpit screaming to pull up, but the control column is dead. The failure is strictly mechanical, not mental.
That is such a haunting distinction. It implies that a person with a severe physical brain injury, or maybe someone with locked-in syndrome, hasn't lost their mind in the literal sense. They have just lost their physical interface with the world.
And that profound thought leads him to his most complex and arguably his most controversial theory in the chapter, his definition of insanity.
Because if a physically broken brain isn't mind loss, then what is actual madness to him? Usually when we think of insanity today, we immediately think of a broken brain. Chemical imbalances, firing synapses going wrong.
Right, the biological model.
Yeah.
But al-Waeli takes a radically different approach. He defines insanity as a schism, a separation between the mind and reality. And to make his point, he actually picks a philosophical fight with the French philosopher Henri Bergson.
I recall Bergson having a very almost poetic view of the mind.
He did. Bergson described the relationship between mind and matter like a fountain. He said consciousness is the water shooting up, and matter is the water falling back down.
It's beautiful imagery.
It is, but al-Waeli absolutely hates it.
He calls it beautiful poetry, but scientifically useless, right?
Exactly. He argues that Bergson made a massive categorical error. He confused two very different things: brain disease and mental disease, or, as he calls mental disease, neurosis.
Okay, let's define those terms in al-Waeli's context, because the distinction is key. Hardware failure is the brain disease, like the soldier with the shrapnel wound we just talked about.
Right, or diseases that were huge concerns back then, like syphilis or typhoid. In those cases, the microbes physically destroy the brain cells. The wires are literally being cut by bacteria. So the mind retreats because it cannot get any input. It is like the radio being smashed on the floor.
Got it. The physical receiver is broken. So then what is neurosis, or psychological disease?
Neurosis is when the radio is perfectly fine, the hardware is pristine, but the station has been violently hijacked. This happens when an intense emotion like paralyzing fear, obsessive love, or extreme grief bypasses the faculty of deduction.
So the physical brain is healthy, the wires are fine.
The wires are completely fine. But the structural hierarchy of the mind collapses. Remember how we said the mind usually uses logic and memory to make measured choices? In a neurosis, a single emotion takes over the control panel.
The mind becomes impulsive. It acts like a machine controlled by a single lever.
Yes. So instead of that complex interplay of, I should do this, but maybe I should consider that, it just becomes fear, fear, fear. It turns into a dictatorship of one emotion. The mind spins in a void, creating its own reality, because that bridge to actual reality is broken by the emotion.
And al-Waeli argues that this actually proves the mind is separate from the brain. Because in these cases of madness, you can autopsy the brain after death and find absolutely nothing wrong physically. It is the mind itself that lost its balance.
The mental unity was fractured by an emotion, not a microbe.
Which leads us to the most dramatic example he gives of this mental hierarchy in action: hysteria, and specifically hysterical paralysis.
This is truly mind over matter in his framework. Al-Waeli describes a medical phenomenon where a person simply cannot move their arm. They are paralyzed. But medically speaking, there is absolutely nothing wrong. The nerves are healthy. The muscles are strong.
So why can't they move it?
Because the mind has decided to cut the connection. It is what he calls a negative will.
A negative will. That is such a powerful phrase. It's not that I can't move it. It's that a deep subconscious part of me is actively willing it not to move.
Yes, and al-Waeli actually gives an evolutionary backstory for this. Now, keeping in mind he uses the terminology of his era, he refers to primitive man or savages. But the biological and psychological point he is making is about the freeze response.
Right, the imperative to go dead silent and completely still when a predator is nearby. Because if you scream or run, you die. So your mind overrides your body's physical ability to make a sound or move.
It literally shuts down the vocal cords to save your life. Al-Waeli argues that this extreme survival instinct is still buried deep in our mental corners. In cases of modern hysteria, that ancient switch gets flipped by accident, usually due to severe psychological trauma.
The mind just screams, cut the connection, and suddenly you are genuinely paralyzed.
It is wild. It implies that the mind is incredibly powerful. It isn't just passively listening to the body, it is actively bossing it around. It brings us back to his core hierarchy. The mental atom rules the brain atoms, and the brain atoms rule the body atoms.
And he suggests this has massive implications for healing, too, doesn't he?
He absolutely does. He argues that if the mind has the raw power to cause physical paralysis without any physical damage, then it must logically also have the power to cure physical ailments.
He calls it extraordinary psychological revival.
Right. It sounds a bit like the placebo effect on steroids. But for al-Waeli, it isn't a trick of the brain. It is the rightful natural dominance of the mental unity over the physical shell. If the mind is the driver of the car, it should be able to override the engine settings.
So where does this ultimately leave us? We've got a mind that is an indivisible unit. You cannot slice it up into character traits. We've got a physical brain that is just a connector, a biological switchboard, and we've got this radical idea that insanity is a software bug, not necessarily a hardware crash.
I think it challenges you, the listener, to completely rethink your own consciousness. In a world today that is increasingly hyper-materialist, where we are constantly looking for the specific gene for this behavior or the exact neuron for that feeling, Al-Waeli is asking us to zoom way out.
He is saying that the you that is listening to this deep dive right now, the you that prefers bread over a stone, is a singular, coherent entity.
You are not just a bundle of firing synapses inside a skull. You are the distinct entity that is using those synapses to experience the world.
It really forces you to rethink the whole user interface of your own life. We casually tend to think, I am my brain. But Al-Waeli is shouting from 1964, no, you are the entity operating the brain.
It is incredibly empowering, really, because it means we aren't just biological robots predetermined by our gray matter. But it also leads straight into that final lingering question we touched on in the outline.
A question of silence.
Exactly. Because if Al-Waeli is right, and insanity is just the mind spinning in a void because the physical senses are temporarily cut, then what happens at the ultimate disconnection?
When the brain completely dies.
Right. What happens to that mental unity when the biological switchboard shuts down for good?
Does the signal just stop? Or now that the loud, chaotic noise of the biological machine is finally gone, does the signal actually get clearer?
Is the death of the brain actually the end of the broadcast, or is it just the end of the physical receiver?
Does the diver finally get to stay in the ocean without ever having to come up for air?
It is the ultimate question of the mental unity. Al-Waeli leaves us looking at the silence of the physical brain, not as a final end, but perhaps as the ultimate liberation of the mind's signal.
Man, that is something heavy to chew on while you drive your biological machine around today. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us.
A pleasure as always.